when I first got my degree, I went to work with a carcinogenesis group, and I was the toxicologist and in charge of some animal work, and we would literally treat animals with potential carcinogens. And one day my boss came to me and he said, I've got 7 samples here, and they're from this company up in Ohio, and there's a lawsuit. And he said the judge said that since one is able to paint the skin of mice and decide whether or not there are certain carcinogens in there, they would like to have that done. He would like to have that done before they decide the case. And these workers, they were cutting fluids, and they had petroleum products, benzoylpyrene and derivatives of these compounds, and the cutting fluid would flow down. Well, these workers were developing skin cancers all up and down their arms, and that's why they had filed a lawsuit. So my professor said, well, take these and test them in the tests we have. He said, but they're probably no problem, but you ought to treat them like they're carcinogens. And I said, oh, don't worry, I will. Well, in a very short period of time, faster than we would ever get the positive control with things like benzopyrene, these animals started developing warts and then huge cancers. And so I went up to my boss and I said, well, these are the samples and these are the results. And he took them to the judge, and these workers then did receive compensation. And I thought, wow, that's why I'm doing this. The carcinogen standard, the first one of the 14 carcinogens, was very important, and it helped form my opinions. One of the things that was a landmark there, and the industry and labor and academia all voted for it, and that was that there would be no more open vessels where carcinogens were being mixed and so forth. Up until that time, you had in large kettles and in all the processing, carcinogens right out in the air, being volatilized and workers breathing them. Everybody agreed that was bad, and that was put in the 14 carcinogen standard. Very important. Now, in that standard was also the lowest feasible level, which the court tweaked a little bit and said, well, you had to do a risk assessment. But I think that that experience with early on was very important. I had been on the Carcinogen Advisory Committee, and I had chaired the Coke Oven Advisory Committee, so some people in the unions got to know my name, the steel workers, for example. And then Frank Wallach from the UAW invited me to go on this, along with about a dozen other people who were in the field, all academicians or in state government, to go on a trip to Sweden to see how they dealt with health and safety. And I saw how the Swedes used education to train their workers on health and safety, and I was very impressed with it. And that probably shaped my ideas in terms of worker training. When President Carter won the election, the UAW, along with other unions, was asked to nominate somebody. And they nominated me. I had no idea they were going to do that. And I laughed when I first got the call from the transition team. I couldn't believe that I'd been nominated. I finally agreed after 2 phone calls from the transition team to come in and actually meet with Secretary Marshall. And I went in, and he asked me if would I consider it, and I gave him all the reasons that I thought that I wanted to stay where he was. And he said, "Oh, you sound just like me, and here I am." So they wanted me to go with Secretary Marshall to see President Carter. And I thought, oh, good heavens. I suppose that was the time when I said, well, maybe I will do this. He described to me his experience with OSHA. One time in a facility where the inspectors had come in with a tape measure and measured the height of a banister and cited the person. And it was a banister around a outdoor lunchroom that had no meaning. And then he said, but then I went up into New Hampshire, I believe it was, and went to a plant where they were making asbestos blankets. And I stood in one end of the building that the manager took me out to see, and I looked, and there was all this stuff in the air. And he said, I said, oh, and the manager says, oh, Mr. Carter, this is before he was elected, you should have seen it before. And the president said, that's what I think OSHA is about. Straightening out and cleaning up places like that. So before I left, I said, well, Mr. President, I couldn't agree to do this job for 4 years. He says, oh, I'm sure you'll figure it out, and good luck. So that was it. It was a meeting of the minds, as one would say. One of the things I recall is concerned the iron workers, and they were on a project up in New England, and they had contacted the local office and said that the workers were up constructing this tower, and I don't recall the exact temperature, but it was very cold and very windy, and they were literally freezing, and the company wouldn't let them discontinue the work for the day, and they had called our office, and so finally Mr. Lyon, who was president of the iron workers, called me and described it, and I called my office and found out. And I said, these workers have a right to refuse dangerous work, and we're going to call it an imminent danger. And so they shut down the place. But it's so important when those things happen that you have that ability to do that. And it takes a lot of courage to do something like that. For an assistant secretary or for the people in the field. I came to OSHA as an academic. I had done research in toxicology, but I came as an academic, and I had to go see people on the Hill before I was confirmed. But one of the individuals that they wanted me to go see was Congressman Obey, David Obey, who was very important in terms of OSHA's budget. So I went to see Congressman Obey, and he said, well, now Eula, what would you like to do? And so being an academic, I said, well, I believe that workers should be trained and should be educated. And it's my understanding that there's almost no money in their budget for that. I would like very much to have a program of training. And he said to me, well, would $2 million help? Now, you have to know this was in the springtime and the budget was already sealed up for OSHA. But Congressman Obie managed to get us at that point in time in the new budget $2 million, and that's how we started. And when I went back to the office, they said, oh, you should never do anything like that. You're not allowed to ask anybody on the Hill for money. And I said, well, he's the one that brought up money. So anyway, that's how we started. I think it's the most important thing out there in terms of health and safety. Educating workers and management is so important. Now, the thing that really was shattered me and made me change my life in terms of construction happened, I don't know, a third of the way maybe through my term. I don't recall the exact date, but it was, I was speaking at a meeting, and I was passed a note, and it said, please finish your talk. You must leave immediately. There's been a horrible accident. And I left the meeting, and Frank Greer was with me, who was a special assistant. And he said, well, we have to go to West Virginia, to Willow Island. And I said, well, what's happened? They were building a cooling tower with a new methodology, and this cooling tower has collapsed, and over 50 workers have been killed. And I just couldn't believe it. And we got on a plane, went to Pittsburgh, drove down to West Virginia, not talking very much. And we got there, and we went by this little house that was at the site, a little building, and there were mostly old men and women, young women, middle-aged women, older women, and children sitting there. And they looked at me with glazed eyes. I was so taken with this. And today I want to cry when I think about it. The tower had collapsed, and they said, do you want to walk out and see where it is and where it was? And we said yes. And we walked out this grassy stretch, and we saw this big, tall man coming toward us. Well, it was Governor Rockefeller, now Senator Rockefeller. And we shook hands and just shook our heads. About a week later, I had to go with Secretary Marshall to the White House. It's very interesting. The president said, would you stay for a few minutes? I want to talk with you. So we were standing by a desk, and he said, I want to know what happened at Willow Island. And I started to describe it, and he said it was green concrete, wasn't it? And I said, yes, Mr. President, it was. They had not tested the concrete. And you know, it's a little thing, but that was a warm spring, and it rained a lot. And this tower, the concrete layers just collapsed. They would pour a new layer every day, and you know, that they should have tested the concrete. There were other things, there were other problems. One of the problems was that the company, this was a new type of new way of making a cooling tower, constructing a cooling tower. And the construction, the blueprints were not on site because they were afraid somebody would steal them and take the ideas. When I first went to OSHA, you could have a bag of or a box or a bottle of the worst toxic chemical in the world, and it was not required that it be labeled. You never knew that you had benzene unless somebody decided to put the label on there. And as a matter of fact, during the benzene hearings, people told about the fake names that were used for benzene. But anyway, we got so many different states and municipalities to pass legislation requiring labeling that finally the industry went to the president and said, "Mr. President, you better let OSHA have a labeling standard." Well, he gave me a version of the standard that in many ways, not in many ways, but in a couple of ways, was stricter than what I was proposing. Unbelievable. Well, the films actually were the project Frank Greer, who was my publicity person, and he and Glenn Piercy, and they started with the films.
I've got a list here of 26 accidents that I've heard about. Many of them serious. A guy got 200 stitches.
200 stitches?
200 stitches. Another guy got shocked with 2200 volts. The one case I think some of the people here are aware of is this case of Jesse Bustos at the 30-inch.
When I finished unscrewing, I had no idea that this piece of steel was supposed to drop on the generator. When it dropped, when I finished unscrewing, when that piece of steel dropped, it grabbed the tip of my glove, and I got caught, these two fingers. I was stuck for 45 minutes.
And it was really heart-wrenching. But they went on and developed the 3 films that were the OSHA films. And when I left office, I realized that someone might decide to not let these films out. So what I did was send copies to all the COSH groups and to a number of universities as well as to the OSHA offices. They tried to recall them all, but the chickens were out of the hen house. I had sent them practically all over the world before I left office. A country that can build the bomb, that can go after gas pipelines, that can do fracking, that can do all these, can build the automobiles that have batteries in them, that can make a country that depends upon the internet. We surely can figure out how to make some of the changes that will keep workers from being so injured. It's not a question of cutting off somebody's hand or arm. It's a question of their body getting old before its time. I think what's important is the best training you can get, and make sure you read the literature, but you have to have it, I don't know, in the gut or in your heart. You have to really care about workers, about people. And if you care about people, you'll care about workers. And you need to go to some places that are terrible workplaces. You can't just go to the companies that have the best of everything. You have to care about people. And you know, if it grabs you, you never get over it. You do it all your life, longer than you're supposed to, I guess. construction has remained a part of my life, my professional life. I'm not very good with a hammer and nails.